Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that won't spoil its ballot paper. And how are you, Rob, on this fine Bank Holiday Monday?
Yeah, I'm very well. I'm feeling relaxed and refreshed. Went to the cricket yesterday to see a comprehensive Somerset loss, so I've started my weekend off with a bang. Hoping it only gets better from here.
It's always good. Is that par for the course with cricket for you, or is that an unfortunate day?
To be fair, it's a mixed bag. I've had more success with Somerset than I have with my football team, Coventry City, and with my rugby team, Bath, and just generally supporting England in any sport. It's a mixed bag. So I've come to expect disappointment.
Fair enough. It reminds me I need to finish editing the How Many Things episode, but that's this evening job. So this week, again, we're going to skip headline quickfire and we're going to go straight into our main story tonight because we've had some elections and we like to have as much time as possible to discuss results of elections. And what elections were these, Rob?
These were the local council elections that happened in England and a few in Northern Ireland as well.
And I think the important thing to mention with this, which I definitely had a few American listeners asking me about this, not everyone gets to vote in these. For example, I voted for my council elections, I think, last year or the year before, in line with the general election. So I don't get to vote for a council this time. It's what percentage of the seats is it? Is it about half or is it less than that?
I think it's about half. It's quite a big one, this, because it's all the councils in England apart from the ones in London. So I believe last time we spoke about local elections on Unparliamentary Language, that was about the London councils, and then there are none in Scotland and Wales as well.
Right, okay. So it is the vast majority of England?
Yeah, some councils do, they elect a third at a time. So they sort of adapt a US-like system where it's in the Senate, where they have a rolling third that goes on. That means it's meant to not change so rapidly with short-term things. But yeah, for the most part, it's all of England.
This is obviously the first election we've had since the general election, I believe, other than maybe a few by-elections that we haven't covered. And also, this is the first proper test of the public's view on what's been going on with this whole mess around Brexit that we've been covering the last few months. So before, I think, if you'd had this maybe 6 months ago, perhaps the results would have been a bit different because people were still expecting Brexit to be delivered on a particular date. Now it hasn't. That has affected the results somewhat. So I think you want to give some more context to that, but that's just a very broad context that this is the first test of the electorate's view of what's been going on, and it is covering a large majority of the country.
Yeah, certainly. The only other bit of context I wanted to add was that the last time these seats in particular were voted on was back in 2015, which again seems like a universe away in terms of what's happened.
Wow, that's pre-referendum, right? So
yeah, they happened on the same day as the 2015 general election, the election that Cameron won and Miliband lost. So the Conservatives did quite well in those local elections as well as the general election, and Labour did fairly poorly. So back in 2015, the Conservatives came out with 5,521 councillors compared to Labour's 2,278. So the Conservatives were defending quite a big lead going into this, and Labour were expecting to make quite a lot of gains considering how far they've come since 2015. The only other thing I wanted to mention as well was that the Lib Dems, this was quite an electoral low point for them. This was the backlash against them being in the coalition. The Lib Dems did awfully in 2015, losing a vast majority of their MPs. And as a result, they lost 411 councillors, and they're starting from a base of 658. So we would expect the Lib Dems to do a little better than the last election in 2015, because to be quite frank, it would be hard to do worse.
I think we're probably going to want to go through all of the parties. Let's start with the Conservatives since they are currently in power. That probably makes the most sense. So how did the Conservatives fare on Thursday?
Yeah, there's no hiding the fact that it was, quite frankly, an awful night for the Conservative Party. Before this, they'd been saying that they expected to lose 1,000 seats, and that was sort of expectation management that was saying, it can't be any worse than 1,000. However, it was by quite a long way. I think in the end they lost 1,351 votes. Let me just double check that figure. Sorry, 1,334 votes they lost in the end. I've got a list as well. They've lost control of 7 councils to the Lib Dems, 2 to Labour, and where they previously had control of 36, now 36 of those are now in no overall control. So that's massive. You've lost control of over 40 councils. Like we mentioned before, in 2015, that was quite a high point for them, so they're expecting to lose some, but to lose on this scale is kind of unprecedented.
And I think possibly my favourite loss they had was they lost Uttlesford. And they lost Uttlesford to the Residents' Association, which is not even, that's not a party, that's just some people locally. So, yeah, it's been, this graph that we will put link to in the show notes, that's pretty damning as a picture. Just, that drop is horrific.
That link you've put in is great, and that's forming the basis of a lot of what I'm saying here, at least pulling a lot of the numbers. It shows really clearly what's happened. They've got a map there of where the Conservative Party lost councillors, and it looks bad purely because it's a lot of rural constituencies where they tend to lose, but they've lost all over the country.
I think that's the thing that's very important to touch on, because London's not involved in this, and there's a few other metropolitan areas, as you say, Wales and Scotland. But you would expect the Conservatives to do well in the rural heartlands, and they have not. There are many councils they've kept that are traditionally Conservative, but they've lost majority there, or not lost the majority, but they've lost votes in some places. I think it was Maidenhead, which is Theresa May's constituency, where they used to have a lead of 35 seats, and they're holding on now with 5. So, that alone, yes, they may have kept some councils in certain places where you would expect them to hold them, but they have lost their majority, a massive part of their majority. And then, you've got a lot of yellow on this map, which we'll get to in a minute, I suppose. So next up is Labour, or unless you have something else to say on the Conservatives.
All I wanted to say is, we haven't touched on why the party lost the vote, but I think with the Conservatives it is pretty clear. Their failure to deliver Brexit was obviously something that the voters wanted to punish them and send a message to them at the polls. That was, I think those who wanted to vote Tory or had voted Tory in the past either didn't show up or voted independent. Like you mentioned, if the Uttlesford result, if that went to a very local issues party, it showed that people weren't, they weren't prepared to vote Labour instead. They weren't prepared to vote Lib Dem instead, but they would give power to somebody who was prepared to focus on local issues instead, and to send a message to the Tories that they weren't happy with their leadership. And just on the leadership issue, I think Theresa May's presence, even though these are local elections and you should vote on local issues, it is hard to escape the gravity of the national situation. Theresa May's leadership has been called into question a number of times, and on the day after the elections, when she was holding a conference in Wales, she was openly heckled by a member of the audience there saying, "Why haven't you resigned yet?" I think it's just clear that her leadership of the Conservative Party is not an electoral bonus at this time. It's not winning them any votes anywhere across the country. And so, it just turned into a perfect storm for the Conservatives, a night where wherever they looked that they couldn't win. And I think for the Conservative Party, they just want to get Brexit over and done with so they can at least move the conversation on to something else, because if it continues like this, it's clear that they'll keep leaking this support.
It's probably worth looking. You mentioned the changed councils map. So there's two maps. If you look at the all councils map, you might go, "Oh, there's a lot of Conservative councils," but as we said, they're rural areas that you wouldn't necessarily expect to change. If you look at the changed council map, there are only 3 Conservative gains, one of which is from Labour, and the rest are from no overall control. And then there is a lot of grey on this map, so there are a lot of places where the Conservatives were previously had a majority, but they are now no overall control. which means they're essentially like a coalition of the councillors that are elected there. Shall we move on to Labour?
Yes, let's go ahead.
Okay, so Labour, they are the opposition party. What would we normally expect them to do in this situation?
Quite frankly, you'd expect them to gain seats on a night where your main opposition has lost over 1,000. Fingers crossed, you'd be able to pick up at least a few of those. In fact, on the night they lost 82 seats, so not the best night for them. I've mentioned here that John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, had previously mentioned in a radio interview with LBC that he hoped they would gain around about 400 seats. Now, in the last local elections that happened in London, Labour had maybe fallen foul to being a little overconfident. They had a very good result in the general election in London and thought they'd be able to take a lot of councils away from the Tories. They didn't, which made what was quite a good night for Labour feel like a bit of a disappointment because it had been bigged up so much. So I think Labour were wary of doing that again, and 400 seemed like quite a modest, achievable target. The fact that they've been able to actually lose 82 seats shows that it was equally an awful night for Labour as well.
Yeah, so it's not as terrible as a percentage as it was for the Conservatives. But as we mentioned earlier, it was at the general election and the local elections in 2015 that they were essentially at a low point. So they've dropped slightly lower than what we considered a low point before. So if you look at it in that, if you look at minus 84, you go, oh, that's not terrible. But also they should have gained seats here. So maybe there's a bit of a sea change there. With people's thoughts on Brexit for Labour, because Labour has been very cagey about their views on Brexit, as we've covered before, and now they've kind of been forced to show their hand because everything's going on. They're in these negotiations with the Tories, and there's various things going on, but nothing has happened really of note in the last few weeks. Because you would not. We'd expect them to gain. They've lost 84. Doesn't look terrible on paper, but really, as you say, they should be gaining 400, so that's like minus 480 over what you'd expect. Is not great.
Yeah, not great at all. As you've touched on there, that I think their main problem is the confusion over their Brexit policy. Maybe I was going to have a little challenge for you. So, can you sum up Labour's Brexit policy in 3 words?
I was going to go with 3 words. 3 words is very hard.
But could you sum up the Lib Dem's policy in 3 words? You could probably sum it up
Cancel
in 1.
Brexit.
Yeah.
Yeah, or 1 word, stop.
Or remain,
Remain, yeah. Yes, exactly. So I'm just trying to see if I can come up with one for Labour. I'm going to say that single market is a hyphenated word and therefore 1 word. So single market maybe, I suppose.
What a message to print on leaflets and to put on signs. If you think we've talked about like take back control, what a good message that was, what a clear message that sent in the the Brexit referendum. The failure to have a sort of snappy line, even a sentence. I don't know if I could fully explain Labour's Brexit policy in a paragraph because it's so nuanced. It's they say that we want to leave, however, we don't want to leave on as hard of terms as the Conservatives do. However, if we get our deal through, then we won't have a second referendum. But if the Conservatives have their deal, then we will push for a second referendum. By what means? ?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really tough, and I believe that Labour's strategy here was that they hoped that, I think one of the messages that I heard from Jeremy Corbyn himself during these local elections was that we are the only party that represents both Leavers and Remainers. We are trying to encapsulate everyone. However, the plan seems to have backfired spectacularly in the fact that the Leavers say you're to Remain and the Remainers think you're to Leave, and both have resolved not to vote for them. It's more concerning for Labour in the north, in the northeast in particular, where you'd expect them to keep control of a lot of those councils. Those are meant to be Labour heartlands. They lost. The biggest one was in Middlesbrough. Labour lost about 14% of the vote there, and there was a big swing again towards those independents. So that suggests for me that there are long-term Labour voters who are abandoning the party. They're not prepared to give their vote to the Conservatives or the Lib Dems, but they're willing to give their vote to a more local issues party, and in doing so, send that message to Labour that they don't agree with their national policy on Brexit.
One thing I'd like to mention here is that I know quite a lot of people in Manchester, having lived there for a few years, and obviously, as you say, it's Labour heartlands as a general rule. One of my friends lives in a Labour council seat where it's just so safe that they just don't canvass for local elections, and the guy still my friend predicted the result, and then the result was nearly exactly what he said. It was like something like 2,000 votes for the Labour person, and then the next nearest person was on like 400. It was like, it's such a majority. But there are places like that are starting to shift. And if Labour's policy has for the last 20 years just been like, oh, well, they'll always vote Labour, then they're going to have to change tack. And a big shift like that would really affect how our politics works, because we have this general assumption that Conservatives will always get a certain number of rural seats and Labour will get a certain number of inner city seats, and that balances out when it comes to a general election. And then there's the swing voters in certain areas that are known to be swing areas. So if those areas start changing, you can see things like we saw in America with the Trump election, where like areas swing across to a different party and suddenly changes the whole voting map. Next biggest party, Lib Dems. Now, those 1,300 lost seats had to go somewhere, and I think Lib Dems are feeling pretty happy right now, aren't they, Rob?
Yeah, the Lib Dems are ecstatic. It was, if you wanted to pick one big winner from the night, it was the Lib Dems, who can sort of, hang their hat on this result and say, we're back, we're relevant again. The dark days of 2015, where it seemed to be all over, and even before then in 2017, where we'd expected the Lib Dems to make gains, but never really were able to do so. This was their big opportunity, and they grasped it. They've won over 703 seats now compared to 2015, and the majority of those gains have been in the southwest, southeast, and the east of the country. So I think the reason for the big Lib Dem win is sort of, there's a few points. We've talked about them coming from a low starting point. The other thing is that where the Conservatives lost out so heavily in rural constituencies, those tend to be a straight fight between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. Labour have never really featured in more rural areas. So where you get both the Conservatives and Labour doing badly, that's a clear gap for the Lib Dems to step in. Meanwhile, in the northeast or in the more, in the cities, in the more urban areas, the Lib Dems are starting from a much lower base there, and we're seeing support there sort of drift towards more independence. So that they didn't pick up the big wins in the northeast of the country, but back in their traditional heartlands, they were able to capitalise and sort of send it back to a more 2010 feel when the Lib Dems were at their peak again. Lib Dems have always been strong in these areas, or at least they were gaining popularity back then. This is a good way to sort of say, yes, we're back. The third point is that, we've mentioned it with Labour, that their message was confused on Brexit. The Lib Dems have a very clear message. They are a party of Remain. It also benefited the Lib Dems that there wasn't really any competition for those Remain votes. We're going to touch on the Greens later, but there was no Change UK starring in these elections. There was no real way to split the vote, and the Lib Dems have that's backed up by the Lib Dems' history of running quite good local councils. I have a little bit of insider knowledge on this, having campaigned for the Lib Dems in 2011. It was just after the after the tuition fees had gone through, so it was quite a tough time to be campaigning on doorsteps for Lib Dem councillors. But traditionally, the Lib Dems have tried to build their success on good local politics, and local elections is their chance to shine. It's hard for them to make a dent in the national elections, where some people feel they might be wasting their vote, feel that a vote for the Lib Dems might let the Tories into power. However, it's a much easier proposition in a local election to think, oh no, I can vote the way I really want to vote, and this will affect local issues, and there's also a far higher chance that my vote will mean something that will be counted. And with that, the Lib Dems see quite a big responsibility to make good on their promises in local areas. If they're able to build up trust or build up a pattern of, successful governance within a local area, they hope that that can be converted into seats come a general election. I think that's worked quite well in the constituency where I was, Bath. Bath has always been quite a heavy Lib Dem conservative battleground. And when I campaigned back in 2011, that was one of the few places that was able to stay a Lib Dem council despite all the bad sort of national publicity that was going around the Lib Dem council at the time, because it was able to promote we've served you well locally for years, keep on supporting us. So there's a number of factors there with Lib Dems. As I say, I'm probably biased because I've campaigned for them, so you can take what I say with a pinch of salt. But this was an election that really played into the hands of the Lib Dems and played to their strengths. So I'm glad to see they've made the gains that they expected.
Yeah. I'd just like to point out, as you mentioned Bath having its Lib Dem council again, Bath and, is it East Somerset?
North
Bath
Somerset.
And North East Somerset, yes.
Yeah.
And that is amusing because that means that Rees-Mogg's local council is now Lib Dem, which is just amusing, I think, that he has to deal with that. So, yes.
And I believe, even better than that, the ward in which he lives is represented by 2 Lib Dem councillors now. So his local councillor will be able to knock on his door and say, "Can I fill in your potholes, Mr. Mogg?" Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the three main parties, and I've shared. There'll be a tweet in the show notes from Vince Capel, kind of saying, that 3-party politics is back. Is the way that this is being spun by the Lib Dems, and there's actually a. If this vote happened nationally as an MP election, and there are caveats to that, as we said earlier, that say the Lib Dems tend to do better in these local elections because, as you say, people are worried that maybe if they voted that way in a general election, then they might be letting the other side win. But if this was extrapolated out, we would have Labour and Conservatives tied on 28% of the vote, and the Liberal Democrats on 19%, which is pretty high. I think that might even be approaching 2010's general election level. Let me just check. Okay, it's not quite the percentage the Liberal Democrats had. They had 23% in 2010. But then equally, the Conservatives had 36%. So, depending on where that percentage falls, could easily mean a lot of seats for the Lib Dems if this can be extrapolated. But take that with a pinch of salt. It's a lovely graph, but as we said, that might not necessarily work out that way in an actual general election. So working our way down the list, next up we have the Green Party, who have also had a very successful night.
Yeah, they've had a wonderful night, even though it's been sort of a modest gain of seats. Sorry, let me just grab the number.
So 194 seats they gained, but they didn't gain any councils.
Yeah, I don't think they would have been expected to gain any councils. I think they had control of one once in Brighton, but I know that the management of that council left some locals displeased. To be frank, the Greens haven't had much experience of government, but the more experience they have, the more time they will get to, learn how to run councils better. But that's where they also had their biggest success in Brighton. I believe they won 9 seats. The Greens won 8 councillors in Brighton and Hove. So that's where they had their biggest gains. But they picked up dribs and drabs all over the place. For a multitude of reasons, I think a lot of them overlap with the Lib Dems. The fact that they are, again, a Remain party. It gives people, particularly in those urban areas where the Lib Dems may not feature as much, it gives those people opportunity to vote for a party that sends a message. It makes them Remain. Also, I noticed I was watching a Channel 4 news article on this situation, and they talked to a man who lived up in the northeast who'd voted Labour all his life, and he said that he voted Green even though he voted Leave and was a committed Leaver, he did so to send a message and say that, I'm not happy with the way that Labour's doing things at the moment. So I think the Greens probably benefited most from Labour's lack of success, whereas the Lib Dems benefited most from the Conservatives' failure in this local election. But it meant both sort of won the day and won out, and they can go away and say, yes, this shows a strong support for Remain. I think one of the big takeaways from social media's perspective was a frustration that the national news coverage and the message of the two main parties was, this shows that we should get on with Brexit, where the main gains had come from pro-Remain parties. There is a lot of nuance in that conversation, which hopefully I can describe in the next bit to show why it isn't all sunshine and roses for Remain. It is a good night for Remainers, but it's still hard to. It's not just a straight up win. There are other reasons at play, and yeah, for that we should move on to sort of like the final group that's harder to quantify that we haven't even talked about yet.
Well, so we've got. I don't know how much you want to talk about UKIP here, but UKIP have lost 145 seats, which is quite a lot. They're down to only 31 seats now. Looks like, as you say, like most of that's funneled into potentially Greens and, well, maybe more Lib Dems. But then we also have this group of others, which gained 661 seats, which is almost as many as the Lib Dems. And I think those are mostly independents and local candidates, but I don't actually have any breakdown. I don't know if you've seen a breakdown of what's in that others section. I mean, some of them must be this residents' association we already mentioned, and there's definitely an independent council in Devon now. So that must be part of it, but I don't actually know what makes up those 1,000 others.
Yeah. I haven't seen a general breakdown of all of those. I think it would be a very long and complicated graph indeed. What I do know from looking at the coverage and the way independent candidates usually work is that they're successful if they run on a very local platform, saying that, the two main parties of national government have let you down. They've shown that they're incapable of governance in some way. What you really should have is one run by local people who will put the local interest first. I'm sounding like an advert for Royston Vasey at the moment. A local council for local people. But yeah, they thrive on that, and that's where a lot of people who would have voted Conservative or Labour in the past will feel comfortable putting their vote. If they're not natural Remainers, and they say that they may look at the local elections, quite frankly, and think, well, I'm unhappy with the national parties about Brexit and I want to send a message, but equally, I don't want to give my vote to the Lib Dems or Green or a pro-Remain party. Then what's in my best interest and what's in my local area's best interest is to vote for this other candidate. And they tended to make the biggest gains, these independent parties, in the northeast, in the north where the Leave vote was highest. There was a council in Bolton that I saw on Channel 4 News as well, where the control of that went to, or sorry, not maybe the control, but a large number of councillors were voted for a pro-independence party, a pro-local party. That when you talk to them, they talked to the leader, and he said, "This has got nothing to do with Brexit at all. This is about putting local people first." And that's partly true, but on the other side, it's if Brexit hadn't have happened, I think there would have been no chance that they would have been able to win in Bolton. People would have just voted Labour, like they always did. The fact is, we are not living in normal political times, and that means that people will vote slightly oddly. They will vote outside of the mainstream. So that's why there's this big message that the mainstream political parties should worry, particularly the main two, because they are generally seen as distrusted by a large amount of the electorate.
Yeah, so with that kind of interesting soup, I suppose, of different positions being... right, but essentially we can't really use those others to help us when it comes to... And I think that probably ties into that vote, the vote extrapolation I've already shown, where it says other would have 25%. But realistically, we know that people don't tend to vote for those local and independent candidates in general elections. So realistically, I imagine most of that other would fall into Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem, and maybe a bit into UKIP, because they've presumably summarised UKIP under other there. So if we're looking ahead to the next general election, which is supposed to be in 2022, but, well, anything could happen in the next half hour. No, but yeah, anything could happen with Brexit. So we will definitely see. I'm definitely not going to make a prediction as to whether or not we will be voting in 2022 or earlier, but I definitely think there's a possibility that it might be pulled forwards. In that situation, what does this story tell us? Because you mentioned earlier that Remain... Well, so firstly, everyone seems to be saying, "Oh, we should get on with Brexit." That's what this shows, but it doesn't seem to. It looks like Remain's done really well. But why is it not so easy to draw that conclusion from like the Lib Dems doing well as a party that votes Remain? We've already touched on the fact they're very good as like local councillors anyway. But what are your thoughts on that?
Put quite simply, there was no hard Brexit option on the ballot. I know we've said that UKIP did quite poorly. I think UKIP have shot themselves in the foot somewhat by moving over to the far right. They're almost the new BNP now. Their leader is anti-Islam, and that's putting off a lot of people who formerly did vote UKIP, but didn't share those certain those hardcore views that the current UKIP represents. You only have to look towards the polling for the EU elections to show yourself that there is still a large desire for people within the UK to, get Brexit done. The Brexit party, led by Nigel Farage, that may go to the European elections if they happen, is polling at around about 30%. That's the biggest share of any party that's standing in the EU elections, and the Remain vote there is split between Change UK, the Lib Dems, the Greens, and Labour, if you consider them a Remain party. There was no Brexit option in these local elections. Some people would say that, all that the message on Brexit was to not vote for the main parties, but I couldn't positively affirm my vote for Brexit in any way, because I know my local councillors can't affect that situation. So, yeah, Remainers should... My point is Remainers should beware. They were able to win a lot of seats, but that was with no other main Brexit opposition there. They will find things a lot tougher in the EU elections, and that might be the place where Brexiteers can really go ahead and say, no, this is our message to get on with things. Certainly, the reason why the Conservatives and Labour are going on about getting on with things, they can see how much damage just the ongoing Brexit negotiations are doing to their vote share. The sooner this is over and done with, the sooner they don't have to keep mentioning it on doorsteps. We've talked a lot about how much we go on and on about Brexit on this podcast, how it's dominated our conversation for the past year. If this keeps happening, it can't be good for either main party. It's not good for our discourse as a whole. I'd love to talk about something else when it comes up. So, yeah, the getting on with it is more of a feeling and a will of the main parties to discuss something else rather than being affirmed by these election results. So yeah, as always, it's never a clear picture on these things. There's a bit of nuance in every conversation.
Yeah, and I think there is a tendency when people are trying to, give a soundbite on the news, they're like, "Oh, well, look at this," and if we extrapolate, and extrapolation is great, but as we know, as you say, like the MEP elections is specifically a vote on something Europe related. So, and local elections are almost the polar opposite of that. And you can see how the general election falls in the middle, because if people are worried that the MPs are not delivering the Brexit they want, then they might change their vote. There's a Europe aspect. They also still care about being represented in Parliament on local issues. So it's kind of a mix of those two. So we probably need both the local elections and the upcoming European elections in only 17 days, and I believe you have to register to vote by the end of tomorrow if you want to get in on those. So it's just another register to vote message from us. I've had a few questions. Now that I'm on this podcast, I do tend to get people asking me some questions that probably would be better fielded by Rob, but Yeah, I mean, I've had questions like, oh, do I have to register on a different electoral roll for the European elections? Like, all sorts of questions like that. And it's like, no, it's the same electoral roll, just register to vote and you're done for everything. I think there are some technicalities when it comes to citizenship, because you have to be a British citizen to vote. Sorry, let me say that again, my mouth went funny. You have to be a British citizen to vote in the general election. But actually, you might be able to answer this for me. I think you can vote in local elections just by being resident and paying council tax. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you still have to be a British citizen to vote in local elections.
I think you can. Again, this is where it gets fuzzy. I'd have to do some research. Allow me to research that for next time, and maybe I can.
That's fine.
Clear that all
throw
up
that in as like a.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. I honestly didn't know. For a long time, I just assumed anyone who lived at an address and could register on the electoral roll. I didn't realise. I assumed EU citizens could vote on the general election, and then I was surprised when I found out from one of my colleagues at work that they couldn't. I was like, oh, that's a bit weird. I just assumed you could. I believe all EU citizens can vote in the MEP elections, regardless of which country they're currently living in, but I might also be wrong on that. But the point is, there's only one electoral roll. Once you're signed up for it, you get put on all the votes. It's also good for like your credit score and things, so it's just a thing you should do. As a general rule, it's one of those things you should do when you're an adult, and you should keep it up to date. And it's actually pretty easy to keep up to date, as we mentioned last time. So, yeah, register to vote. But yes, when we combine these two things, the MEP votes coming up and the local elections, I would imagine we get a clearer picture of what a general election would be like by the sum of those two votes. Because, as you say, I mean, in the MEP elections, I imagine there will be a lot of people who are like pro-Brexit voting for Brexiteer MEPs. So then we will see more what their makeup will be.
Yeah, I think the other thing that the two main parties will take away from this, you mentioned like when a next general election will be, and we've talked about it on this podcast, that it might be the best way to break the deadlock in Parliament over Brexit. With the percentage, with both parties being predicted to get 28% of the vote, I don't see Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn jumping for a general election anytime soon. I would be really worried if I was them, because A, it doesn't look like either side's going to win a majority. B, both sides might actually end up losing seats, and they might give way to another third party. The Lib Dems may grow, but also you may see, if Nigel Farage was to take a Brexit party into a general election, that could pick up a couple of seats, or at least send a big message. If it takes a lot of percentage of the vote, again, that breeds more political frustration. It just doesn't seem at the moment as a viable option to break the deadlock. So I think the most likely result of these local elections, this is my sort of cheeky suggestion at the end of what the two main parties could do to avoid some embarrassment in the short term. There's been a lot of talk in the newspapers recently that a deal between the Conservatives and Labour is 99% done on how to get a deal through Parliament that could end to us leaving out the EU in an orderly fashion. That looks like something like May's deal with a little bit of customs union thrown in on the side. If Labour and the Conservatives are able to get that through, then that would mean that they could say, we don't need EU elections because we're leaving already. Abandon those. That stops Nigel Farage getting his moment in the sun for being able to point to a table and say, look, hard Brexit got 30%. He doesn't have the opportunity. He misses out on that. They may be able to silence some critics. Conservatives were able to say, we got Brexit delivered. Labour would be able to say, we got Brexit delivered, but it's a lot softer than if we just let Theresa May have her deal go through. And both main parties would, fingers crossed, hope that would calm a lot of the mistrust around politicians, at least in the short term. However, the consequences could go entirely the other way. You could have Remainers leaving the Labour Party as a result, because they feel betrayed by that. Hardcore Brexiteers may also decide they want to leave the Conservative Party as a result of that deal, because they feel that it's not hard enough, or that's not the Brexit that they voted for. So again, it's high risk, but but it's one way to break the deadlock and at least stop the two main political parties getting further egg on their face come the EU elections, because they simply won't need to happen.
I suppose my one question I have, in your opinion, is, so you said 28% and they're tied, not a good position to run a general election for either of the parties. What kind of polling do you think they'd need before they feel they'd be safe in trying to call an early general election?
The Conservatives would want one where they were leading by quite a long way, put quite simply.
But what kind of, like, is that 35 to 29? Because that's what got us a coalition government, percentage-wise. So I suppose I'm interested in how the percentages tie in to constituencies, because it doesn't necessarily, 35% of the vote doesn't necessarily mean all the constituencies. As we know, the Lib Dems once had 23% of the vote, and they only got like 50 seats, which is not 20% of the electorate seats available. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think at this moment in time, the Conservatives would be happy with like 35-29, because the Conservatives tend to need fewer votes for a Conservative MP than you do a Labour MP. That's because Conservatives tend to live and represent far less densely populated constituencies in the countryside, which they can win with far fewer votes than the Labour heartlands, which are quite urban, they're quite densely populated, and as you mentioned before, in Manchester, there are some areas where you could stick a Labour hat on a dog and it would win because it's Labour. They're so strongly, and they win such a large percentage of the vote, and that kind of skews it slightly. So you've then got to look at the regional differences and where the parties are picking up votes there. So if you look at the local election results, the Conservatives will probably lose seats in the southwest. They may lose seats in other parts of the country, but would Labour gain enough seats to take control? Probably not. They're not making the gains in those areas that they should do. The Lib Dems would take those seats instead. And in rural areas or in the marginal constituencies, I believe the Tories actually won a council in Derby, which is like classic Labour Conservative marginal territory. So at the moment, I don't think that Labour would have the votes to break the Conservative deadlock either. A general election at this point really is, I don't know what the figure is that would cause one, but I think it's a long way away, and based on the results of these elections, neither side can go into them confidently, yeah. Confident of victory. Yeah.
So one last wild hypothetical, and that is, we have a general election. It's a very close tie between Labour and Conservatives, and the Lib Dems are almost back to the levels they were in the coalition. So you can't form a majority government using confidence and supply with the DUP. You have to sway the Lib Dems to your side. Do you think there's any way the Lib Dems would ever side with the Tories again? Or would they'd have to pick Labour, essentially? Or would they come up with some kind of confidence and supply? I appreciate this very kind of like, the Czech landscape can change between now and a general election, but if that was the case, what do you think would happen?
So I don't think the Lib Dems would go into a coalition again. They couldn't take the risk electorally. They ran on a platform in 2015 where they sort of said, coalitions are good. Remember that we would give a heart to a Conservative government and a brain to a Labour one, was their policy in 2015, kind of saying that that was an election that was also, the polls predicted that there would be another coalition government, so that's why the Lib Dems were sort of positioning themselves as kingmakers, saying that we've been in coalition before, we can do it again, whichever sides win, we're here to help out. That backfired spectacularly. They're only now regaining the seats that they lost back then. I don't think they would jump in. And more importantly, I don't see the benefit of them jumping into a coalition when they are so strongly Remain, and Conservative and Labour are the Brexit sides. So probably what's more likely, you may see a kind of a national government coalition. It's happened out of peacetime. I can only bring to mind once out of peacetime. Maybe there may have been one just after the First World War, but certainly in the 1930s, Ramsay MacDonald was a Labour Prime Minister who had about 30 Labour MPs with him, but commanded the votes of the rest of the Conservatives within the House. And that was to deal with a national crisis, which was the Wall Street crash and mass depression, and how you sort that out. That scenario could happen, but that's very, very far-fetched. We are talking like real hypotheticals, but if you are looking for a Brexit coalition to exist within the House of Commons to get a Brexit deal through, the only realistic one would be between Labour and the Conservatives. Now, I can't see Jeremy Corbyn working with Theresa May. Those lot are ideologically opposed on a lot of issues, and to do so, I think, would be highly damaging for both parties, probably more damaging for the Labour Party if they were to go into a coalition with the Conservatives. But if they wanted to get Brexit through, I think that's the most feasible coalition that could exist, but it's a very small chance of that happening.
Okay. Oh, that's... Yeah, I suppose, that's kind of what I expected, but I did wonder if maybe you thought there would be a reason they'd go into a coalition with Labour. But I can also see with Labour's position on Brexit being very unclear that unless they could sway them to remain, it would be a bad move politically.
Yeah, it would. I think it would have to be if you wanted. Yeah, sorry, that was one possibility I didn't even fathom. A Lib Dem Labour coalition would only be possible if Labour promised a second referendum. I think they'd have to have that nailed on. However, when the Lib Dems went into coalition with the Conservatives, they were promised a referendum on voting reform, and the Lib Dems ended up losing that spectacularly. So Lib Dems they've taken the risk in the past and seen it backfire. So I don't know if the Lib Dems would take the risk again.
Yeah, so we've discussed local elections and how that would kind of tie into general elections. And I think if we're going to go now to our quick polls update. So quick polls update. And in our quick polls update, I'm going to post a graph in the chat for you. But yes, go to our usual link. Oh, it paints a slightly different picture. Conservatives are, if you look at it's now been consistent since the start of April. Well, sorry, since the 5th of April. Labour has been positive in all of the polls except for one that was a tie. And I think now that we've got a bit more data, you can see it's coming clear here that Change UK is really taking away from the Conservatives. And Conservatives had a massive drop, and they're massively below Labour on this. But based on this, you think Labour would want to call a general election. So what are your thoughts on that, Rob?
My advice would be to look at the graph that not only Change are polling on about 3.7, but you've got the Brexit Party on 6.8% and UKIP on 7.5%. I'd say they are taking away from the Conservatives quite a lot as well.
Yes, I misread that. The green colour is the Brexit Party, not Change UK. I read those the wrong way round. Yes, so there's a lot of loss from the Conservatives to the Brexit Party, whereas Labour seems to have had its loss with UKIP maybe earlier on in the year, and is now kind of staying steady.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of confirms what we've seen from these local elections. I mean, personally, I think local elections are the best form of poll. They are people going to the, voting rather than, just expressing an opinion. But Labour being so ahead in these will give them cause to celebrate. They would certainly hope that in a general election, the Brexit Party would split the Conservative votes, and that would be the window they need to win those seats that could bring them a majority. In normal two-party politics, you would see a drop of that amount lead to a big gain for Labour. The fact that it isn't shows that we are rapidly moving into a 2.5, 3-party system where there will need to be, where there's more factors in play. And so that's the one word of caution I would give to Labour for calling a general election. You may be 10 points up in Comres polling, 3 points up in YouGov polling at the moment, but there's still a Still a long way to go. And more importantly, it's not within Labour's power to call a general election. It's within the Conservatives' power. And so results like that, polling like that shows such a dramatic drop-off means again that they're not going to be calling a general election anytime soon.
Yeah. No, I mean, if I was the Conservatives watching that, I would definitely not call a general election right now. And it is actually, on that view, it is the lowest the Conservatives have polled. So that's since sometime in 2015, probably. I think this is a 4-year view, so it would be early May 2015. They have not polled that low on average with all the polls, which is impressive. But yeah, 2 new parties thrown into the mix very much changes the maths. So thank you as always, Rob, for joining me. And we love an election, as everyone knows. So these are always some of our favourite episodes to do. If you want to come along and listen to us while we're recording these episodes live, you can join us on Discord. There's a link in the show notes, or the doobly-doo if you're on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on both Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. I really need to upload more videos to our Instagram, but I will get on it. And you can also come and support us at patreon.com/TTSS. Also, as I mentioned in the last episode, I went around the London Marathon. If you have to pick between giving money to a cancer charity or to us, I'd rather you gave it to a cancer charity. That link will still be in there. I think it's open until July, my fundraising, but I've beaten my goal now, so any extra money is great. If people want to donate, that's great. I ran a marathon. I'm a crazy person. So I don't think there's much else to say. So as always, Rob, it's been a pleasure chatting to you, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. And it's goodbye from me.
And it's a goodbye from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Where the Conservatives lost out so heavenly. So heavenly? Let me start again.